I'm not assuming that too many people in this auditorium follow Telugu. Am I right? How many of you actually follow Telugu? Okay, most of you don't. Let me introduce the film. I mean, let me actually try and locate this film in two contexts. One is the geographical context, the context of Telangana and Hyderabad, which is quite important for the film, as well as the linguistic one. First of all, this is a film about the Telangana armed uprising, an important event not only in the late 40s and the early 50s, but also in what unfolded over the next few decades in that region. This is also a film which, in a way, grandparented some major developments in the decades to come, including, and I'll just say this as a provocation, including a film like Pushpa, the kind of dialect it uses in the film, that's used in these two Pushpa films, owes a significant debt to the way in which Maa Bhoomi uses a particular dialect of Telugu to locate it in a geographical region, in a political context and a social context. Now, there are, in fact, this over the years has been owned as a Telangana film. Telangana today is a state, but Telangana of the period that this depicts is the hotbed of an armed insurrection. We'll see some details of that in the film itself. But there are, in fact, four different, shall we say, invocations of Telangana that this film is directly contributing to, or directly or indirectly contributing to. One is obviously the 1948, 52, 51 armed insurrection about which the film is. The second is the moment when the film was in fact made. This late 1970s, the film was released in 1980 but censored in 79, made around 79. And that was the context when a major uprising, a major movement for the formation of a separate state of Telangana from within what was then Andhra Pradesh had been quelled. It was seen as a movement that was betrayed by its leaders. The leaders joined the Congress and that was the end of the movement. There was a lot of police violence against protesters, and that remained a very, very raw kind of a memory in the region for decades to come. So the film is released when the second Telangana uprising movement is quelled. And it's also released at a time when the Maoists are gaining ground in the countryside of Telangana. Okay? The CPI Marxist-Leninist People's War, which later on became CPI CPI Maoist, was formed in 1980. And a major figure associated with the Maoists appears in the film itself, Gaddar. And I'll have something to say about Gaddar during the discussion, but one of the sequences you look out for is towards the end of the film when Gaddar appears in person to sing a song which is associated with the 1940s Telangana movement. So those are the three key political landmarks that this film is directly related to. A further one is that from this point onwards, Telangana becomes yet again the space for a major armed insurrection. And a whole range of films and popular music is produced in the Telangana region about the armed revolution in Telangana, and Telangana becomes the site of heroic battles against oppression. When you watch the film, look out for very detailed and almost ethnographic depictions of conditions of labor. Vetti is important. Vetti is forced labor. There's also Begar. Begar is labor that's performed without any expectation of return. It included the offer of services free of cost to the landlord. The landlord was called Dora. You will hear references to the Dora. Dora meaning master and so on. But in the Telangana context, Dora is the landlord. A little bit of history here. The Doras were often Deshmukhs Doras are not just ordinary landlords. Doras came with administrative and judicial responsibilities. Doras had a police force that assisted them. They also had their own paid servants to take care of law and order. What happens in the second half of the 19th century is that the Deshmukhs emerged as revenue officials who also were major landlords. Deshmukhs controlled the Paragana. Paragana was 20 to 60 villages. And they became the de facto landowners because peasants from the region abandoned the land due to high revenue, land revenue. So they became extremely powerful. They were revenue collectors and landlords. So what you'll see is a peculiar kind of landlord, one which is believed to be almost unique to the Telangana region, extremely oppressive, not only because they were exploiting, extracting land revenue, but also because they were demanding and being offered a whole range of services that were perhaps not being offered to landlords in other parts of the country, right? You will see officials of the Nizam state. You will see the Razakars. The movie Razakar. That memory is still fresh or is still being rekindled every once in a while for political reasons. Obviously, the Razakars were basically a militia formed by the then recently elected head of the MIM as a pressure group to sort of force the Nizam to not accede to the Indian Union, but also it turned out they became a private army they became a militia in service of the landlords, of the Doras. So you will see the Razakars as well. So it's a complex kind of history that is presented to us in remarkable realist detail. The film was very widely appreciated when it was released in 1980. It also had its critics among the left who thought that it was not revolutionary enough, but it also very, very widely praised for its realism and the detail with which it depicts rural life, rural customs, and the kind of the forced and exploitative labor and exploitative conditions that they lived under. So I'm sure you'll enjoy the film. And we'll have a discussion after the screening. Thank you. Yeah.
Just a quick thing. I mean, it's fairly obvious that this is a film that's really merits a lot of debate and a lot of discussion on a lot of different ways of getting at it. There were a couple of things I wanted to say before we start the conversation. I think SV gave the context of Telangana, which is, of course, extremely important. And this is, in a way, the framing context of the film itself. What's extremely important is, of course, the fact, as he pointed out, that the film was made in 1979, which is what qualifies it as a new Indian cinema film and also qualifies it for our program, which is called the Radical 70s. And there is a very, very important reason for why a film made in the 70s in Telugu, referring to the 1940s, was making a very contemporary film. Why it was that the 40s was such a contemporary issue for the 70s in that particular region. But there's more to be said. Two things I wanted to say. One is that, as you know, those of you who have been attending previous screenings, that this is the fourth screening that we've had in our Radical 70s program. As you also know, the purpose of this program, as per MAP's priorities, is to focus on young people and the youth. And one of the major issues was to do with young people turning political. What constituted in the 1970s, particularly, the political turn of youth at that time. I say this also because it's sort of my generation, maybe a little bit earlier than yours, but we were the ones who came of age in the 1970s. And there was a sort of a reason for why we turned political in that sense. Now, this is the fourth film in the series. We started with Mrinal Sen's Interview. We went on to screen 27 Down. We then screened Uttarayanam, and today is the fourth film we are screening. Now, there's nothing obvious that connects these four films, but when you put them together, it does seem that the Ranjit character played by Ranjit Malik in Interview, the character played by M.K. Raina in 27 Down, the protagonist in Uttarayanam and Ramaya, do have a genealogy. There is a lineage in a sense, right? There is a certain subjective condition that leads somebody to become political within the language of the radical cinema of that time. I mean, Ramaya, for example, has a similarity in the way that, the question of sexuality, I mean, the fact that he leaves the city, he leaves the village in a way because Chandri, he feels betrayed by Chandri. Then he goes to the city, he is incapable of sexual relationships, and in a sense, his radicalization emerges as that form of subjective self-expression, as it were. That's what qualifies him in a sense as this kind of a new cinema protagonist. This was one thing I wanted to say, and I wanted you to say a little bit about this particular new cinema framing of the Telugu context, right, and in Northern Andhra. The second thing I wanted to say was that, and this is a political history we're familiar with, one of the things I've been discovering, as we were discussing yesterday, that the attack on Hyderabad or the siege of Hyderabad by the Indian state, that is to say, when Jawaharlal Nehru sends in the troops and quells the Nizam and the Razakars, this is seen in a sense as an attack on feudalism, but it is also seen as an attack on the Communist Party. You will note that eventually Ramaya is killed by an Indian bullet, not by the Indian state, as it were. That is important. As I was saying earlier, I was reading this remarkable book by A.G. Nurani, which actually locates the siege of Hyderabad on a par with what's going on, what happened in Kashmir. Having the same sort of political history. But the Nehruvian narrative on this is an attack on feudalism. He had this whole thing about the erasure of feudalism being the purpose of the Indian state. And as a result of that, in the 1970s, a large number of Indian films are made in the new Indian cinema that locate feudalism in India. The kind of feudalism that the modern state is supposed to oppose in Telangana. So Telangana now becomes the metaphor for feudalism across India. Yeah. So, you have many, many different films in many different contexts that actually locate themselves either realistically or metaphorically in Telangana as constituting, if you like, the absolute exemplar of the sort of feudalism the Indian state is now going to be opposed to. Many of the films are in Telugu. So this is extremely interesting for me that a new Indian cinema film made in Andhra is made by a Bengali director who is hired, Goutam Ghose. Goutam Ghose is, of course, best known to all of us as one of Bengali cinema's iconic filmmakers, Par and Griha Juddha and so many other films. So somebody like Goutam Ghose making a Telugu film as his first feature film is preceded by Mrinal Sen making Orka Uri Katha in Telugu, also located in Telangana. The Malayalam director Ravindran making a film called Harijan, also in Telangana, and most famously of all, Shyam Benegal, whose Nishant, second film Nishant, is also made and shot and located in Telangana. So Telangana, in this particular sense, becoming a metaphor for Indian feudalism and the Indian state, if you like, sending in the troops, becoming, if you like, the kind of metaphor for a new form of the new Indian cinema and a new kind of narrative which is associated with subjectivity. I thought this was one of the frameworks within which one wanted to talk about this film. There are many others. And I'm wondering if you would like to say a bit about this particular trajectory of the new cinema and the way that it actually becomes then the framework of why Telangana gets discussed in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. Also to just recall here Madhav Prasad's argument about new cinema presenting a certain kind of feudal as the reason for state, as it were, that is, and considering that these films sort of coincided with them, at least some of them coincided with the emergency, that the sort of the interventionist state is now, this is what you are going to be shown is a very backward region, a very backward, politics, which is almost calling for the intervention of the state. Right? I think there is clearly, a borrowing here Nishant was a few years earlier, and one can see that there are quite a few, elements from Nishant that this particular film borrows. But I also want to draw attention to what's the real significance. I mean, what is the significance of this film vis-a-vis both New Indian cinema? In a way, this is the end of New Indian cinema, right? This is 79, 80, and this is pretty much the end of that particular phase of new cinema.
Krishnan, of course,
he continues, and individual filmmakers, Mrinal Sen continues. All that happens, but that particular initiative is sort of coming to an end. This one too is not funded by the government of India. It's funded by Narsingh Rao and others, Ravindranath. So there's an interesting sort of. It comes at an interesting turn, and it also, while we are right in juxtaposing it with the films of drawing looking at the lineage of new cinema, we should also look at the sort of very local kind of history that film history that it's drawing on. I had some slides, but I won't show them now. But it was made at a time when N.T. Rama Rao had reached his peak. Okay, but the immediate background, as far as a certain kind of communist or even Naxalite cinema is concerned, is Bhoomi Kosam, which is a 74 film. And when Maa Bhoomi was released, one of the the reviewer of the film, right? I mean, in the review published by the official organ of the Revolutionary Writers Association, which is a Marxist-Leninist kind of front organization, cultural organization, he pointed out that the difference between this and Bhoomi Kosam, which was also a very radical film made by a Naxalite sympathizer, has several of these elements that this film has, is that Bhoomi Kosam is a very melodramatic film, whereas this one, while it's borderline melodramatic, it sort of stays away from going melodramatic in a sense that it's marking a departure from the way in which the movement and the movement and the repression on it was being depicted in the Telugu film scene, okay, or whatever little depiction there was. Now, the other key difference is that while this film is looking back at the Telangana movement itself, in many ways it's talking to the absolute present of that time. Okay, and what other filmmakers did not have, and what a filmmaker or producer, scriptwriter, Narsingh Rao, based in Hyderabad, based in Telangana, himself a sympathizer of the Naxalite movement.
Sorry, can I just ask, because everyone may not know, can we just talk about the late 70s and periodize it a little bit?
Yeah, okay.
Just a little bit more detail about what was going on in the late 70s in Northern Andhra. Then Northern Andhra.
Telangana. So the Naxalite movement, as many of you know, it begins in West Bengal, but it spreads to different parts of the country. It starts with north coastal Andhra, but moves quickly to Telangana, where it takes very strong roots. So late 1960s onwards, you have sporadic acts of violence by rebels, and by the 1970s, they're reasonably well organized. Within a few years, they start splintering, as has been the history of the communist movement in India. And by the late 1970s, or actually exactly in 1980, the year this film was in fact released, the group that then becomes the most prominent insurgent group in India, which is the CPI, Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist People's War, popularly known as PWG, People's War Group, that's formed in 1980.
And is the producer of this film sympathetic to the People's War?
He's, shall we say...
Say a little bit about who B. Narsingh Rao is.
B. Narsingh Rao is an artist. He is an actor, filmmaker, a scriptwriter, filmmaker. This is the first film with which he is associated, but he goes on to make several other films. And all of them are set in Telangana. All of them are very faithful to the to depicting life and struggle in Telangana. The next film is incredible. The next film made just 3 years after this, Rangula Kala, directed by him, also featuring Gaddar in some songs. I'm digressing a little bit from New Indian cinema, but Narsingh Rao, carries over from this film the idea of witnessing, of bearing witness. The film as a depiction of something that happened, something that will not be talked about, but also the witness figure in the film itself. Right? Now, what you see here is the sort of the merging in the film, the activist or the revolutionary subject, the oppressed subject, the revolutionary subject, and the witness, all the same person. if not the same individual, is really the same set of people. What happens in Rangula Kala is that there is an agitation going on. There's urban strikes and violence and police repression and all that happening. And the witness to all of that is this bourgeois, angst-ridden, artist figure. A remarkable final sequence in the film when, finally the artist reconciles to his life as the witness, and he has these, paintings that he leaves behind, as it were. So the idea of presenting the real, the reality, the violence of it, the rebellion against oppression, that's a very important concern in that phase of Narasimha Rao's career. And I think this film, considering that it's also scripted by him, we need to give him due credit for some of the elements that it has. Okay. Now I'm saying the difference between Maa Bhoomi and some of the other films, especially the angst-ridden, protagonist films that we have, is that this film is in fact set in a moment of tremendous violence again. Released at a moment of tremendous violence once again, but a moment also of great hope because the movement's really spreading now. Okay, it's once again spreading, and post-emergency is really the time when it enters a mass mobilization phase all over again. Okay, and there's also references to the Jaityatra, where there's a large movement of peasants, and the revolutionary writers are very active at this point of time, and so on. I think that's a critical difference. Although you do see, in a way, this is coming at the cusp of new Indian cinema sort of moving in another direction, and that is in fact not one direction but two directions, because what happens almost immediately, but not necessarily responding to this particular film, is a popular sort of takeover of an insurgent kind of cinema. So the insurgent becomes a hero in a whole range of low-budget popular Telugu films made by the mainstream industry. So over a period of time, what you find in this, digression here, in this film, the most important film industry figure, Telugu film industry figure, present as an absent presence in the film is the narrator Jaggaya, Kongari Jaggaya. Okay, old left background, theatre background from communist movement and so on, but he remained a very, very important mainstream actor throughout his life. So Jaggaya is the voiceover narrator. There's only one other major actor played by the character who's Ramaya's father. That's the only other major actor that you see in this entire film. Everyone else is either completely new or a very, very minor actors. There are other interesting connections with older legacies of rebellion and revolution and so on. The hero Sai Chand, the protagonist Sai Chand, his father is Tripurani Gopi Chand, M.N. Roy's follower and a radical humanist. His grandfather, Tripurani Ramaswamy Chaudhary, was a major anti-Brahmin activist, writer and intellectual from the pre-independence period. So there are very interesting trajectories that this film brings together, which makes it far more local than any other new Indian cinema film that was set in Telangana. I'm not talking about the Malayalam films. They have their own histories and so on. So there's a very, very different kind of ethos to this, very different, personalities involved. Gaddar himself becomes, what he became. Also becomes an important figure for cinema and mass culture in Telugu. Right? So those trajectories make it at once, a new Indian cinema film and something else. I'm not saying, by the way, that it's some authentic Telugu film out there. It's not. It's a very unusual Telugu film. Very few Telugu films of this kind were made till that point and even subsequently. Yeah.
But this, we'll open this up now for conversation for those of you who may have any questions or comments. But I have only one other question. And that is that, we're all very familiar, again, talking about youth, this angry young man, yeah? This idea of, it's we always think of Amitabh Bachchan as the quintessential angry young man, and Diwar and all those kinds of films as being the exemplars of that anger, and the politics of that anger being associated, in a sense, with the period leading up to the emergency, the kind of strikes and the agitations that started sort of from the late 60s, in Bengal, in northern Andhra, in Bihar,
and at other places which then went on to, the Navnirman agitation in Gujarat. And of course, the most famous one is, of course, the Bihar, agitation led by Jayaprakash Narayan, which actually, in a sense, became the direct context of the declaration of the emergency itself. And the emergency saw an enormous political crackdown on this youth, this whole generation of youths. And, you had thousands of students and young people killed and jailed, especially in particularly in Bengal, really, that was where it was. But, this happened in Kerala, it happened in many parts of India. Now, it was the case that the new cinema did take on some of this politics, and it becomes quite an important part of our screening also to talk about this political context, right? The early Indian documentaries, so the first Anand Patwardhan films also emerge in this time and in this framework. So Waves of Revolution is about the Jayaprakash Narayan movement. The next film, Prisoners of Conscience, actually talks about political prisoners during the emergency. But what also happens is that along with the political upsurge is a popular culture upsurge that takes place. And there is a connection then that is drawn, and in the Hindi cinema, this is probably most familiar to all of us. Some of the energy that Salim Javed will bring to their Amitabh Bachchan characters comes from the new Indian cinema. The new cinema's radical youth actually also becomes a new kind of mass cultural proposition. Now, this happens in Telugu. And I'd like, you worked on this as well. One of the big names you mentioned, the others, is of course the legendary Gaddar, who appears in the film. That whole song that is there is him. And Gaddar, of course, then pioneers an entire kind of a revolution of popular culture, which is then leads to a kind of a music industry, a video music industry, and of course the famous Red films. Red films being a kind of a popular Naxalite cinema, which was enormously popular in Andhra Pradesh. Somebody that you worked on, the famous Chiranjeevi, begins his career almost like a kind of a Bachchan-like figure, a radical figure who also may have his origins in the radical practices of that time. So I'd like you to say a little bit about how political radicalism leads to a new mass culture or a popular culture. This is very much an area of your PhD, so you might say a little bit about that. Bachchan is a bit of a red herring here because, you're absolutely right to point out that while, it seems he's the most obviously available angry young man kind of a figure, but you do see, elements of that even here. Of course, this is slightly after the early Bachchan, but, some years before this, you start noticing the young rebellious figure, often a peasant or a student. And there is an upsurge. There's either there's an individual rebellion or a kind of a collective rebellion, and that figure keeps reappearing. There is music that emerges around the same time, and that's again music that's traceable back to the 1940s Telangana movement. It draws on folk tunes, but the content is very new. The themes are new, and what constantly starts happening is that while the communist movement is drawing on this music to propagate its ideas, film industry is drawing on both the lyricists of the movement as well as the tunes to do other things with the same music. Okay? So there is both happening, and I think one of the obvious points of convergence is the figure of the evil landlord who now becomes a kind of a fixture in popular cinema, or the evil industrialist becomes a fixture from this kind of cinema. But also, interesting is the fact that, in fact, this kind of popular, red film becomes almost like a parallel. The equivalent of a parallel cinema. It's not parallel exactly. It's made by the same industry. It's usually low budget. It's the kind of cinema that launches new talent
either new musicians or new actors, actresses. Vijay Shanti, some of you know Vijay Shanti quite well. Vijay Shanti emerges from this kind of cinema. Chiranjeevi himself emerges from this kind of cinema. The references, the borrowings from new cinema in Hindi. Not necessarily in Hindi, but Bengal and others is very, very clear. Okay, so there is clearly that from the late 70s onwards, that becomes a huge resource. New cinema becomes a resource for commercial Telugu film industry to sort of create a new kind. To sustain itself, to grow, right? As far as the music is concerned, I think more than just Gaddar and his contribution to the Telugu film music, this music becomes extremely central to the more recent agitation, movement for the Telangana state, which was eventually successful, right? This was the second statehood agitation. What I'm referring to is the late 90s. It begins in the late 90s and it continues all the way and reaches some kind of a pinnacle, some kind of a high point in the 2010s. And by 2014, as we all know, the statehood is granted to Telangana. Now that moment is really one which cannot be understood without, which doesn't make sense at all. That the mobilization is, the soundtrack of the mobilization is really Jananati Mandali, Gaddar's, a group. Gaddar and Narasimha Rao, by the way, were the founding members of Jananati Mandali. He is the producer of this film, Narasimha Rao and Gaddar himself. So those tunes which Gaddar popularized are everywhere to be seen. The form of performance that Gaddar and his team, his comrades in the Jananati Mandali popularized, that became very, very mainstream during the Telangana movement. And it became, it became the stuff of reality television, for example, in the 2010s. There was Dhoom Dham. That was a form that was, that's a name given to the form. And it continues today. That remains very much the kind of popular mass cultural sort of idiom of Telangana to this day. It's not very, very often heard in films. There are a whole set of films in which it's heard, but that's the mass culture of Telangana as of now. Yeah, sorry. Oh yeah,
you can do that. 1 second. But I just wanted a little announcement and a thank you here. Vinayak has a story to tell about this, which is that one of the reasons why we're able to have this screening is B. Narasimha Rao, the name that has appeared before. SV has mentioned him a couple of times. That we were trying very hard to get in touch with Mr. B. Narasimha Rao. We had a telephone number for him, and he was either not taking calls or he would say he'll call back. And suddenly, Vinayak gets a phone call from B. Narasimha Rao, who then speaks to him. And after which, what happens is that in Vinayak's, in his mail arrives a pen drive, and that pen drive includes the digitally remastered Maa Bhoomi, which is what we are seeing today, and the collected works. The collected works of B. Narasimha Rao, including Rangula Kala, Dasi, and we were hoping for Harijan, which is the Telugu made by Ravindran, which is not available, which also Narasimha Rao had produced. So this is a little bit of a cheer for the absent Mr. B. Narasimha Rao.
And also Mr. Vinayak.
And Vinayak. This is also to indicate the manner and conditions under which film work takes place in India. It is actually finally just a pen drive that arrives in Vinayak's address that leads to a lot of this happening. You will notice that you'll notice that the reels we have, that the leaders that are there in between reels. Now, it must have been annoying to some of you, but it is actually archivally very important. It exists as the closest that we are going to ever have to what's known as the director's cut. This is probably how the film was originally conceived. There were other versions. We know of other versions which, that final battle that takes place in the dead of night, not the final, the one before the Indian army arrives, is missing in the versions that we had.
a much shorter version. So this is what we have.
This is the context. Just to quickly run you through this, N.T. Ramarao, Krishna, Mahesh Babu's father, by the way, more N.T. Ramarao, all these films in 1979. And 1980, Shankarabharanam, some of you might have heard about it, probably the most famous K. Vishwanath film and so on. And then you have Bhoomi Kosam, which was made in 1974. That's Jagaya, by the way, the narrator in this film. Okay. And you can see that, the Jamuna, also another important left figure, very mainstream, Chalam there in the corner. Once again, a key figure in some of these small budget, films that were being made around that time. This is clearly a very different aesthetic. We've seen it. It's also evident from the publicity of the film. You see the sort of almost like the rhizomic growth of the red film from this point onwards. Vangapandu is Gaddar's colleague, comrade in Jananatya Mandali. He's from North Coastal Andhra, and he sings songs in the films of Narayan Murthy, starting with Adharatri Swatantram. This is the red film made by very often Communist Party, the mainstream communists, CPI, CPM, not the Naxalite. This thing. Yuvataram Kadalindi, released in 1980, okay, and followed by Yarramalalu. This is N.T. Ramarao's emergence around the same time, and an advertisement for another red film called Mahaprasthana. Mahaprasthana is the name of a poem written by a very famous communist poet, Sri Sri, and so on. Multiple sort of very intricate connections there. And you have Gaddar himself and Narayan Murthy, who starts literally dressing up and singing and dancing. I mean, he doesn't sing by himself, but dancing like Gaddar in the films that he makes. Okay, and that's Gaddar and Narayan Murthy. And we move on. Gaddar during the Telangana movement, he is extremely important. And that's Narayan Murthy's Sini Viplava Geetalu, which is revolutionary film songs. And that's Vijay Shanti there in the corner. She was initially in the Congress, and TRS back in the Congress, and so on. Yeah. And finally, it becomes a Telangana film. The red film becomes a Telangana film. A cinema that's very much in support of the statehood demand. Okay. I think this is it as far as the slides. Yeah. This is Rangula Kala, the last sequence. Literally, you see once again the close-up of the eye and the witness. And this is what he's witnessing. The workers being shot down by the police. Okay, can we go to the clips, please? Do we have time? I mean, do you have patience? Okay, so let's start with the first one. This is Vangapandu's voice that you hear. The tune itself is already familiar. It was used, it comes from the Naxalite movement in North Coastal Andhra, not Telangana. And this, you will see a Gaddar-like figure played by a famous red film director called T. Krishna, who actually dies before the film is released. So the film is dedicated to him. It's called Adharatri Swatantram. Narayan Murthy, Narayan Murthy, Gaddar clone that you saw in the previous slides, his first film. Okay, yeah. Can we go to the next video? This is Yuvataram Kadalindi, 1980, released in 1980. And you see the climax, the kind of borrowings there are from Shyam Benegal's work, but also coincidentally similar to the shaky kind of camera. This is Smriti Irani, by the way. Jai Bolo Telangana, 2010. Okay, it's a film that is very much in support of Telangana, and Gaddar appears as himself. And there's a brief scene in which you see Narasimha Rao also. Okay, so this is now Gaddar appearing on the screen as himself in support of the Telangana agitation. And I'll stop the show and tell with this. Yeah, go on. By the 2010s, Telangana becomes the space of is the land of sacrifices, the land of suffering. It's also the land. It's also the region where there is a demand for there's a movement to take back what is one's own, and what is being taken back is the land itself. So that is Telangana on the very moment when the statehood demand reaches its peak, and that's when actually it becomes successful. Now, some of this is directly traceable to Maa Bhoomi. Some of it is, via Maa Bhoomi and other such initiatives in the 1970s and 80s, an excavation of the Telangana armed struggle of the 1940s and 50s, so that it becomes very much a resource for the present as far as the 70s and 80s are concerned, but also the present as far as the 1990s and 2000s are concerned. And the role played by music, the role played by the narrative of Telangana, the narrativized history of Telangana as the space of exploitation, but also of rebellion and revolution, that is, absolutely the running theme of every account almost about Telangana from roughly this Maa Bhoomi's time. Okay, yeah, thank you.
I'm very interested in the use of the hammer and sickle and the Karl Marx and the communist thing. I can, in Goutam Ghose, made a few years before the emergency, the hammer and sickle were not allowed. It was you could have red flags, but you couldn't have that symbol or any particular symbol on those flags whatsoever. So I'm wondering if the emergency or what the difference in politics in India over these years made a difference, or is it really more of a regional thing? Is it did this film have to go through the same censorship process as Goutam Ghose? I'd also like to know something about the success of the film after it was released.
Censorship, it's a complicated question to the extent that one of the strange problems is that very few of the filmmakers during the emergency, Mrinal Sen, Shyam Benegal, many others, very few of them were actually censored. I was actually not aware of the Goutam Ghose censorship thing, so I'll have to go and look that up. But what is being censored and what actually emerges within these different film industries are almost kind of parallel questions. They occasionally intersect, but not necessarily. It does not seem to me that censorship becomes an overdetermined, at that time at least. In the years leading up to the emergency, a little more so. So it's a curious little history, and I mean we'll have to work this out as to why. I mean, what is actually the history of films censored in India versus what is this particular kind of political cinema that emerges? It's a complicated question, in short. Sorry for an inadequate answer.
Yeah.
You had something?
I think the success of the Wikipedia entry is a little misleading because it says the film was a major commercial success. It may have been given the fact that it was made with a very low budget, but it was, in all likelihood, it was released as a morning show in several parts of the state. In Hyderabad, within a few days of the film's release, I managed to see the listings in Hyderabad cities. It was listed in 2 theaters as a morning show film. So basically one show per day in 2 different theaters. And that seems to have been the kind of run it had. It ran for several weeks though. It ran for several weeks. It was widely appreciated You have newspapers with audience reviews saying that the film is fantastic. It's done something very new. It's done something very different. But commercially, it wouldn't. I mean, definitely not comparable to, say, the NTR films that we saw, or Shankara Varnam, which was considered to be an even bigger hit than most NTR films. So it did well for its scale, and it was well received.
Yeah, hi sir. So this is, you just had a footnote about T. Krishna, and I just read that R. Narayan Murthy considers him as his mentor, and that is how he entered into his films. So I just looked at T. Krishna's filmography, but it's a very short filmography because he got cancer and he died. So how do you think his influence was in in Telangana or Andhra on the red films that you've talked about? And okay, so that is one. And the second part is that, so R. Narayan Murthy talks about his films and how his films died is because of the absence of Nela ticket, or the lower class ticket slowly got removed. So that is why he says that the demand for his films has completely died down. So what is your comment on that?
See, the red film was not necessarily a region-specific film, right? Especially the 1980s red film, with T. Krishna and others participating in it, right? They were shot mostly outside Telangana, right? And they were also, the dialect spoken in the films, the songs, not all of which had to do with Telangana. There were no references explicitly to Telangana. There was a reference to the movement, which was, in fact, located mostly in Telangana. So I think the regional turn is visible only in the late 90s, early 2000s, when it starts becoming, it's a certain kind of red film is made, which is really the Telangana film. Otherwise, the setting can be Telangana, like Ore Riksha or, Ose Ramulamma, which were huge successes commercially. But even there, it's not very consistently that the accent is used. Okay, so they're not in that sense making any major claim to being, rooted in Telangana culture or in Telangana politics. They were popular in the region. People were watching them in the region. At least according to in the 1990s, the reports of police cracking down on theaters exhibiting these films because they thought Naxalite sympathizers were being sort of, spawned in these theaters because of these films. Yeah.
I just want to add, because I'm from Warangal, and this whatever you just said now happened a lot. Like my father used to tell me that from the period 91 to until 95, 97, this used to happen a lot, where films and people who attended these films, their bike numbers were noted down by the police and all that. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Hi. So this film, the story is from the pre-independence era. So how did the Gandhian and non-violence ideas affect the communist uprisings or the armed uprisings of the villages? Yeah, I mean the non-violence ideas. So were there any interferences from people following non-violence and all? There were armed uprisings against the army and all. So were there any oppositions for this?
Okay, let's try this. See, the thing is that one thing that one mentions is that Gandhian politics takes a mass turn at certain particular moments. I mean, it's from roughly, I think, the late 30s. That's when it actually becomes a mass movement. There are many other mass movements there are many other political uprisings, if you like, that happen at that point of time in competition or contest almost with the Gandhian uprising. Now, the communist uprisings that take place, for example, in parts of southern Kerala, in the Travancore district, in northern Andhra, in Bengal, actually take place in conditions of, this is in a way the nationalist interpretation,
feudalism. So the nature of feudal oppression. See, remember that feudalism, the zamindari system, is a British construct, and the film establishes it. So there is a particular kind of king, let us say, or a prince or whatever, who's very often propped up by the British, who will say that, look, you will be the de facto king and we will protect you, we will make sure that you live in style. So a particular condition of decadence associated with the zamindari as they who become the sort of rent collectors of this. Now, extreme zamindari was often the source of communist uprisings, and we should remember that well into the early 1940s, the possibility of Indian nationalism taking a communist turn, that the Indian state actually becoming, joining China, for example, in allowing for a socialist uprising, was a very real possibility. And there was a big difference of opinion then between this communist faction, the Congress socialists associated with, for example, Aruna, Asaf Ali, and others, and a kind of a right-wing Congress, which is typically associated with Vallabhbhai Patel, for example, around what kind of freedom struggle we must have. My understanding, now you SVL know the details of, my understanding is that this particular communist uprising in this region didn't, I mean, it was one of the great frontiers of communism. And P. Sundaraya, who has a very famous book called The Telangana People's Struggle and Its Lessons, actually speaks about this as being the Yan'an of India, the Yan'an uprising in China being the staging ground for Mao and the Maoist uprising, So there were real possibilities in a way that the Telangana movement of the period from 44,
yeah,
till about 48. Now,
46 is a keep.
What happens is that when Nehru, as happens in this film, sends in the Indian troops and they quell the Razakars and they quell the Nizam, they also quell the communist movement. They actually ban the Communist Party. They create a situation of the almost the elimination of many communist cadres. So A.K. Gopalan, for example, is put in jail, in 1950. And, one of the great cases associated, by the way, which is very important for the UAPA, was actually a case that happens with A.K. Gopalan in 1950, in this time. So, all I'm saying is that the communist possibilities of this area, or of Purnapra Vayalar, for example, in Kerala, in parts of Bihar, what is today Chhattisgarh, and Bengal, were possible. I mean, there was the naval uprising, for example, that took place in 1946. There were the INA trials, the Indian National Army trials that had also existed at that point of time. Now, you will have to answer the more specific question as to whether there was any Gandhian influence on this region.
Yeah, it was there. There were definitely, congressmen in the state of Hyderabad, as well as, in the smaller, in the capital city of Hyderabad, but in the smaller towns as well. I'm not aware of any opposition of the kind that is, that meant, say, siding with the Dora or siding with the Nizam. Okay. In fact, this film, I think, is quite interesting in that the problem emerges after the Nizam abdicates. Now, after Hyderabad is merged with the Indian Union. After Hyderabad becomes a part of the Indian Union, that's when the Congress says that now let's and that's also when actually the members of the Communist Party itself start saying, look, now we are part of the Indian Union, we have to withdraw this. And 1951, the Communist Party resolves that they will stop the armed struggle. And this was opposed by people from within the party itself, but the struggle is, the armed struggle is formally withdrawn, right? So I don't think it's like, of the kind that was a very active and on the ground kind of opposition. It was a little more complex, partly because, the countryside was completely, there was very little government in the countryside, and it was too dangerous for any other kind of activity to take place. You were either for the Nizam or against the Nizam. There was not much else that was possible at that time.
So the thing about the feudalism being a British construct, no?
Sorry?
feudalism being the British construct or something. So when the scene, in the scene where the villagers are bringing in goods for, so in that scene, the welcome is being taken place with British or English music with all those, but it's kind of watered down. But it is not, exactly at the level of, English music or that standard. What I mean to say is the people who are playing those, bagpipes and all. The music does not seem, very sophisticated and all. It's a bit watered down, and it suggests that the zamindar is being treated, especially, but it is not very equal to the British. That's
no. That may not be the situation that's being depicted here. So the English band, of course, was all the players were Indians, right? Okay, and now here, this is obviously some ceremonial thing that's been created by the Dora's own people. It's not like the British have sent the band there. They are imitating their master's master. The master being Nizam and the master's master being the British.
Yeah, imitation I was talking about. They want to, create an image for themselves. That's what I mean.
Yeah, when we are talking about the Nizam and the Hyderabad and Telangana, right? I just wanted to add that, a major chunk of Karnataka also was part of Hyderabad back then. And being center of this, very feudal kind of struggle, I think Telangana and even Hyderabad, Karnataka region, what they call it, became a melting pot of very different kind of politics. The BSP became very strong over there, and then there is Madiga uprising for the internal reservation thing, and then there is also I think Telangana was one of the last red corridors in India, right? Like northern Telangana and Chhattisgarh region. It was one of the last red corridors of India. So the thing is, despite all these struggles, I think the power never went to the people, right? Like, despite Telangana becoming a different state, all the credit went and taken away by KCR, and then he enjoyed power. And the left, I think, never came to power in Andhra or Telangana, right? If I'm not wrong, yeah. And even NTR, right? Like, he also wrote on this Telugu pride. Yeah, that's all. It's just a commentary I wanted to add. Despite all the struggle and all the movements, the power never went to the people. It always stayed with that Kapu Kamma Reddy thing. Yeah.
Last word.
Yeah, I mean, what can we say? You're absolutely right. What unifies the two states even today is the fact that it continues to be ruled by 4 or 5 powerful castes. Yeah.
So I think during the introduction you said something like this film was criticized for not being revolutionary enough. So can you maybe elaborate on that and what your thoughts on it was?
It doesn't end with any triumphalist kind of declaration, right? It ends. I think it's an important and interesting ending. That ending suggests that the struggle continues, and that's absolutely relevant for the late 70s because the struggle continues. Indeed, it does continue. Okay, but what was being criticized was that almost like what they read as a kind of a defeatism in the ending, that it was defeated. So you're saying that again, the objection was not a major one. That one of the criticisms against the film, while appreciating the review I will refer to, was largely appreciative of the film, but said, maybe it could have been a little more radical. That was, it's almost like a, sense of regret. Yeah.
One should mention that the tragic structure was very much a new cinema phenomenon, but it's not even that. I mean, for example, K.A. Abbas's legendary Dharti Ke Lal is a tragedy. It ends in a tragic mode, there's more to be discussed on that front. Okay, so thank you all very much. Thank you once again, SV. Thank you, MAP, for making this happen. And see you all in January with our next film, which we have to still figure out what it is.